Hello everybody, welcome to finally the new video. I know I've been promising this for months, but my time has been taken up a lot with doing external audits and product releases and product updates. So now I've eventually found an hour to get around to talk about some more concepts within quality, and more specifically today we're going to be looking at one of the concepts within risk. Now, risk is one of the most complex parts of quality, and carrying out risk assessments, if you don't do them properly with proper acceptability criteria, you can have a lot of problems down the road. There's not actually a lot of value in doing a risk assessment if you haven't set the criteria before. So this is what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at specifically the concept of risk acceptability criteria. And within that, we're going to be having a look at the new ISO 14971. It's not as new now, but it's going to be definitely be implemented with IVDR. So it's definitely something that businesses need to get ready for. They need to start understanding what the purpose of looking at risk is and how risk works. So first of all, we're going to have a little bit of the history of ISO 14971. The first edition was published in 1998. And then there was a second edition published in 2007, and the current version, which is the one I'm talking about of all these updates, was published in 2019. I think the implementation date for that was 2020, but I'm not entirely sure on that. So these are the new, what's sort of in 14971 more generally, not the specific updates. So ISO 14971 sets out the standard for risk management with respect to medical devices, and it contains guidance on risk management standards to be used in all stages of life cycle of product, from design and development all the way through to post-market surveillance. So really it's looking at the risks and feeding back into your original risk assessment. So it's creating these loops of information. So you put a product out into the market, you get post-market surveillance in, that allows you to highlight new risks, which then can go into your risk assessments, and then you can assess the risks of those and see if there's any new risk controls that you need to bring in to control newly discovered risks. There's also a new accompanying document, because it used to be that 14971 was set out with annexes. They've actually separated those annexes out now into a separate document, which is called ISO 24971. It's an accompanying document with this standard, and it's actually a really, really good document. After you've read 14971 or doing anything in risk, I definitely have a look at this companion document, because it sort of gives practical examples of how to carry out risk management process. So it shows you how to actually do risk assessment, how to set risk acceptability criteria with specific examples as well. So it will take you all through that. So it's a really, really good document, actually. So what's changed in ISO 14971 from 2012 to 2019? There's quite a lot that's changed in the structure of it, but there's also some new definitions in there. And the specific definitions that have changed or been added are benefit, reasonable foreseeable misuse. And one of the key ones that I want to highlight here is a concept called state of the art. Now, state of the art is, as a concept, is basically looking at the wider market and seeing what the accepted technology, the accepted risk, the accepted use is in general literature around. So it's sort of doing that due diligence of looking at other similar products on the market and ensuring that your product is in the same sort of state as those other examples that are already in the market. There's also a new definition for harm. I'm not going to go into specific definitions apart from state of the art, just because we're going to focus on risk acceptability criteria in this video. So there's a new requirement to have a risk management plan. And if residual risk is unacceptable, a benefit cost analysis must be carried out. That's really important, because when you do a risk assessment, you can never usually reduce all the risks to zero. So what you're supposed to do then is have a look at what your residual risk is, and then if you can't reduce that any further, you can justify it on a benefit cost analysis. And you can do that benefit cost analysis by looking at your product and by looking at the state of the art and looking at it's not just the financial benefits, it's the medical benefits, and the costs are not necessarily financial costs, they could be medical costs as well, and also impact on wider markets as well, because obviously some medical devices, there's demand in markets. So if you have a risk, and that means think you can't supply, and one of the costs is that those markets will go without that product, obviously. So these all need to be included in your benefit cost analysis. There's also the inclusion of the post-market surveillance part into the risk management process. As I was saying before, you're supposed to use your post-market surveillance to then feed back, to highlight any new risks that have been detected in the market, and then go through the risk management process again. So again, it's supposed to be an iterative sort of process. So now we're going to focus a little bit more on risk acceptability, and this is what I want to really go into today. And actually, these are the specific, the top point here is actually the specific reference from 14971. So it says, top management shall define and document a policy for establishing criteria for risk acceptability. The policy shall provide a framework that ensures that criteria are based upon applicable national or regional regulations and relevant international standards, and take into account available information such as generally acknowledged state-of-the-art and known stakeholder concerns. Now that's a bit of a word soup there. What I've tried to do below here is to try and put that into less what I call quality language and into more everyday sort of language. So what I've said is, this means that there needs to be an overarching policy document that shows how a company determines what risk is acceptable. The key thing to understand here is that a risk for one product may be completely different to another product. For example, if an IVD test has an accepted false positive rate of 0.1% in the state of the art, but another test has an accepted false positive rate of 1%, then the acceptability of false positives is different in the two products. So your policy should not define an overall risk acceptability criteria, but a policy for how to decide what risks are acceptable. Now, I know a lot of people use risk matrix, which are fine to use, but the thing that needs to be defined is the scoring of that risk matrix, because a lot of people use occurrence and severity as the two axes of those matrix. And they then define the severity through a numbering system like 1 to 5, and then you do some sort of multiplication, and then you get an answer out at the end. That's absolutely fine as long as you define what each of those numbers means. So, for example, if 5 was unacceptable severity, if you could define that as causing death, because if your state of the art says that your device is not supposed to cause death, and then you look in the state of art, no device has ever caused death, you know that the risk of causing death for your device is not acceptable, and hence it will be very high on the severity scale. So defining those numbers within those scales to what it means to be rank 1, what it means to be rank 2, rank 3, rank 4, rank 5 is extremely important, because there's no way to properly quantify risk if you don't define what each of those categories or that quantification fits into. A lot of times in the past, risk has been done in a very qualitative way, where it's been sort of been done based on the opinions of people, and it's been very grey about how you score these risks properly. Now there's been more of a move to make risk and analysing risk more of a quantitative process. So you're defining your categories 1 to 5 before as part of your risk acceptability criteria, and then you're doing the numbers that you're actually putting into the grid actually have a meaning rather than just arbitrary numbers that somebody has decided. So I think one of the main things to take is that, and the key thing in this is that each time you do a risk assessment, your risk acceptability is going to be different. And your risk management plan should state what your risk acceptability is for that specific product, not for across the whole business, across the whole product range, but for a specific product. As I've stated here, if you have differences in your product with false positives, with side effects or potential risk to patients, you need to consider each device individually for risk acceptability. You can't have an overarching risk acceptability criteria. So how to determine if a risk is acceptable? So when you're carrying out risk analysis, before you even start any analysis, you need to consider what is an acceptable level of risk. And this can be done through a number of tools. You can look at current literature around in the market to determine the state of the art as it's defined. You can carry out a benefit cost analysis of the product. And as I was saying before, you can use a risk acceptability matrix. But again, you have to make sure you're defining those numbers properly, because if it's going between multiple people, different people might rate a risk slightly differently if you have grey categories, so a little bit of leeway in your categories. And that's not what you want in risk. You want everybody to be on the same page. You want everybody to be seeing the risks and seeing what the potential probability of them happening, what the severity is if they occur, and what the failure modes are from them. So if you do this before you do a risk assessment, you'll know how to score everything before you even start. So here's a risk acceptability matrix, and a lot of companies use these risk acceptability matrices to determine risk acceptability, of course. However, this tool is only useful if scoring accurately represents risk. So you can see here on the left-hand axis, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we've got on the bottom axis, we got the severity, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now here, it's not defined what is meant by 4. So how are you supposed to know what devices fall, or what sort of failure modes fall into the increasing severity high category if you don't have that high category defined and what it is? But obviously, when we're talking about the risk being tolerable and whether a risk is acceptable, is in this orange area through the middle of the risk acceptability matrix. That's what you would call your risk acceptability criteria, because you're accepting these risks here as tolerable. So you have to know what is acceptable before you can define what is tolerable. So you need to think about these things before you do the risk assessment. So the yellow area in the matrix is defined as the level of acceptable risk. Once the risks have been fully mapped out, it's important to use the matrix to work out whether these risks are acceptable, and if they are not, then risk control measures must be considered. It is important to define each category on each axis of the matrix to make a proper estimation of risk. For example, on the severity axis, what constitutes whether a risk is very high? This should be defined before starting any risk analysis without proper risk analyses. Without proper categorization, it's impossible to score the risk. And this can be done by asking the following questions. So this is just an example. Does it cause death? Yes or no? If it's yes, it's probably a 5. But again, if you've got a device that in the state of the art, there is an accepted risk of death of low percentage, then even answering yes to that question doesn't necessarily make your device fall into the highest severity category. It most likely does, but it depends on the state of the art in the market. Then you can ask whether it can cause life critical damage, yes or no. Medical intervention required, yes or no. Reversible injury, yes or no. And when you decide how you're going to categorize each of these severities, you should then make a reference to the state of the art of how you've justified that scoring. So you can make references to documents you looked at. You can make references to products that you've looked at their adverse incident reports and things. All of this can contribute to defining your risk acceptability. So what mistakes do people make in forming risk acceptability criteria? Error 1, the biggest one, risk assessment matrix in the QM manual. The risk benefit analysis and thus risk assessment matrix must be product specific. Therefore, it generally does not make sense to define risk assessment matrix in the quality manual or in a risk management SOP. The method for determining scoring and categorization, however, can be within an overarching risk assessment policy. So you can have an overarching policy that states how you determine a risk acceptability criteria. So you could state, a process. So you could say, when you're determining your risk acceptability criteria, when you're looking at your severity, refer to this sort of post-market surveillance or go through this process. So you can have a high-level process document there for defining your risk acceptability, but you can't how to determine your risk acceptability, but you can't have a overarching document that defines what your risk acceptability is. So the second error a lot of people make is risk acceptance is not derived quantitatively. So many manufacturers instinctively set risk politics. And what I mean by risk politics is that they do their risk assessments in a way that the risks are already justified, rather than going into a risk assessment with an open mind that you might find something out about your product that you didn't know before, and you might not realize that you have to control. So there's no point of doing a risk assessment if you've already decided that is acceptable. You need to go in with an open mind. A typical indication for this is when they determine the acceptability criteria based on a risk priority number. Now, I've not really used risk priority numbers before, but if people are using them, then it's not really the correct way to be doing this. As I said, but that does not make sense for the most part, because the number that separates the red and yellow areas cannot be systematically and quantitatively derived, and the separation of red and yellow areas would have to be discussed in the risk assessment matrix for each severity. It applies for each severity class to estimate the benefits and risks separately. So you can see by doing it that way, it's very complicated, because you have to go through each category and define why that risk is tolerable at that point in the risk acceptability matrix. And sometimes making that justification is extremely difficult. So a risk priority number, which can incorporate 3 parameters, severity of damage, likelihood of errors, and probability, contradicts the definition. In summary, quantification of risk is based on scores, which are categorized using qualitative criteria. So what that means is what we were saying before about having 5 as your death severity, 4 as life-changing injury, 3 as injury, 2 as incorrect result or no result, and 1 as, I don't know, something else. You're basing those categories off of qualitative data criteria and data that you collected either in your post-market surveillance or by looking at the state of the art, rather than setting the numbers arbitrarily 1 to 5 and letting people estimate where it lies on that scale. You need to give specific categorization. So 3, the risk policy and risk assessment matrix are not updated. Risk policy and acceptability should be dynamic concepts based on an ever-changing market. This is why having an appropriate post-market surveillance process in place, which feeds back into the risk acceptability criteria of each product, is critical. What may be acceptable now may not be acceptable tomorrow. Technology and science moves forward, and your risk assessment should be constantly reviewed to ensure that the risks posed by the product have not changed, but also that the level of residual risk is still acceptable in the market, or whether that needs to be some product improvement processes implemented. This is key for looking at development of products. You need to be aware of what the market is around you. So then you can work out, go back to your risk assessments, look at your level of residual risk that you have there, and then re-looking at your benefit cost analysis of that residual risk. Because if the state of the art has changed, technology has moved on, and devices have become, for example, less false positives, and you're still at the same level of risk acceptability for false positives, you're not going to do very well in the market, because people are just going to go with the product that has the fewer false positives. So by having that post-market surveillance, by having that feedback into the risk processes, you're making sure that you're keeping up with the demands of the market, and you're keeping up with the demands of the stakeholders as well. So I know a lot of that was a little bit complicated and very quality heavy, but these are very key concepts within risk that need to be understood. Risk acceptability is different for every product. It makes no sense in defining risk acceptability in an overarching policy or procedure. Risk acceptability changes constantly with the state of the art. You should have a process for ensuring post-market surveillance captures changes in the level of risk or affect the benefit cost ratio for a device. When creating risk acceptability matrix, the scoring should be based on a series of well-defined criteria for each category. That is probably, for people that are not involved with post-market surveillance or anything like that, and are just doing risk assessments or product risk assessments, that is the most important point. When you're doing your scoring, make sure you define your categories properly, so people can make sure they can score the risks appropriately. So what, as I say, right at the end of here is refer to ISO 24971 for practical examples of how to carry out risk analysis. It's really, really useful document. So if you get a few minutes, definitely have a read through that. And if you have any other questions when it comes to risk acceptability, feel free to send me a message on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to answer any questions or have any conversations. So I hope that was enlightening for all of you. My name's Simon Bailey. I work as a quality assurance specialist, and hope you have a great day.